Today's AskReddit post. Serious, what's your story of seeing somebody's mental state degrade? Oh boy, this is gonna be a good one. Let's get started. I watched a friend get overtaken by his first bipolar episode in about 3 weeks. He started smoking a lot more weed than he had before. He was on Snapchat and social media non-stop. He started drinking heavily as well. And barely sleeping. He totaled his Jeep and got a DUI. He went to his job and told his boss to duck off, among other things. He was fired. He started getting angry very easily. During this time I spoke to his mom to let her know what was going on, but she was in denial still. The drinking and mania continued for another week. He went golfing with some friends, and as they were driving home, he lost it and started ripping his clothes off and tried to jump out of the car. They pulled over and he was screaming for someone to come and kill him. They calmed him down enough to get to the hospital, where he stayed for a few days. This all happened in 3 weeks. He's better now, which is really good to see. Grandma. She had Alzheimer and dementia. She started losing her memory slowly over time. Then one day she fell and broke her hip. Being bedridden accelerated her illnesses, and within a couple of months she was just laying there and staring at the roof, barely speaking, and all she says is nonsense. She doesn't recognize anyone, not even her children. It's like she's not there anymore, and all that's left is her body. The sad part is that she's been like that for years. Dead but not really dead. That we can't even mourn her, probably because all the sadness and tears were shed while her body still lies on her bed. Watched my dad join a cult, get diagnosed with cancer, get dumped by the cult and die alone. It was horrible. One of his friends used the word sick as in ill, and that really made so many of his choices clear. He was dying. He felt like poop. He didn't want to get medical care. He became mentally unstable and ended up pushing everyone away over 9 years. He got his wish. He died alone. This is so sad. Let me tell you. He was my best friend. It ducking sucked. My fiance's mom passed a few years ago from Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, CJD for short. CJD is most commonly called mad cow disease, even though they aren't the same. CJD only happens to humans and mad cow is bovine. CJD is when these proteins in your brain called prions go crazy and starts to fold and basically turns your brain into Swiss cheese. There is no cure and it is very rare. Only a few hundred cases a year. She was perfectly healthy except for being diabetic, but she had 0 complications with her diabetes. Then out of nowhere she started having problems remembering things and then starting having mood swings. She went to the doctor, but they couldn't figure out what it was. It wasn't until a month or so later that a specialist diagnosed her with CJD. She went from being completely healthy to not being able to move her arms, legs, control voluntary and involuntary functions, and then death in 8 months. It was extremely hard on my fiance to see her mom lose everything that made her who she was. Her own mother and father had to see her deteriorate as well. I was just awful for the whole family. When we came back from my deployment, I literally watched my then husband become a shell of the person he previously was. Prior to the deployment he was so light, optimistic, and social. He slowly transitioned into a man afraid to leave home and eventually began to use substances and was finally released from duty because of it. We still remain friends after all these years, but he's still only a ghost of the person he was before. I am so sorry. This is awful to experience. At some point you have to accept that the person you loved is never mentally coming back. It's truly heart-wrenching. That was the hardest part. You want to be there for the people you love, and it's hard to decide where to draw the line between being there for someone else and being there for yourself. It was definitely a rough time. Thank you for your kind words. My own. I went from a happy 13 years old to being molested for 3 years, dropping out of school, becoming a drug addict, dealer for 20 years, married, then divorced. Wasn't till after that I got help, had some time in a hospital, got antidepressant medication then, and only then realized I had been depressed and going downhill since the age of 13. 7 years later, been drug free for the whole 7 years. I am off meds now and enjoy life. Thank you for sharing a happy ending. Needed this today. Yeah, for real. I need to get the duck out of this thread on this somewhat happy note before I keep myself awake all night empathizing with the mental trauma of my fellow humans. My group of friends witnessed two friends go through a paranoid schizophrenic breakdowns, one after the other, in the space of 2 years. The second one was my roommate. It happened very suddenly. He just woke up one day and decided that we were all lying to him all the time, and acted with the hostility and contempt that you would expect from someone who thought those things. He did erratic stuff like smashing all his belongings with a baseball bat in the driveway and piling all his socks on the kitchen floor. He eventually went back to his parents' house, which was a relief. From what I have heard, he never really got the help he needed. Recently found out that it actually started a year before I thought it had. Being manic is a hell of a drug. I'll tell ya, I was a powerhouse during my junior year, but don't really remember my last 2 years of high school. Sadly, had a full-on mental breakdown the last semester of my senior year. Till I got diagnosed bipolar, I was a shell of my previous self. Didn't eat, rarely went outside, didn't talk to my numerous friends. It was a hard time for my parents, seeing me deteriorate so completely. I mean, I went from being one of the most popular kids in my high school to barely being able to get out of bed. My parents don't talk about it. Friend fell back into addiction. I thought I felt powerless as I listened to him downplay his use. I felt even more useless as he started looking off into corners, then said the voices that he was hearing weren't from meth. They were from living with his parents. While I was away, my BF went over to him holding a kitchen knife to keep his parents, who were half a world away on vacation, in the basement. He hid in a bench for 6 hours. Finally, he called the cops on his voices. Visited him every day I could in the mental ward. When he got out, he blew up our friendship, went missing, went back into the psych ward. That's the last thing I knew. When I was in graduate school for psychology, my aunt and uncle called me over to their house because my cousin refused to get out of bed or go to work. When I got there, I witnessed my cousin in his bed laughing at random statements he made, smiling in a bizarre way, and looking at me and saying lewd comments about intercausal behavior and what he wanted to do with me. This was completely out of character. I told my aunt and uncle something was clearly not right, and I suggested we take him to a behavioral health center. They balked at the idea, insisting my cousin was just trying to get out of going to work. Meanwhile, my cousin gets out of bed and became agitated, shouting random intercausal comments and saying he was going to beat everybody up. We called the paramedics, and they had to restrain him and then took him to the behavioral health center. My cousin was placed in a locked holding area, and he kicked the walls, jumped around, and yelled. It was hard to watch. The intern psychiatrist asked me several questions pertaining to my cousin's genes. My cousin was adopted and we didn't have any valid information. Anyway, his diagnosis ended up being schizoaffective disorder. He's never been the same. How can schizophrenia appear all of a sudden? What are the causes? This heavily involves psychedelics. But a friend went from being shy and not very talkative to very erratic with suicidal spouts and just eventually shutting themselves off. Whoa. And here I was considering psychedelics to deal with my mental issues. I didn't realize they could make things so much worse like that. A lot of it has to do with people taking a lot. You gotta eat the whole eighth of mushrooms to completely break down your ego is the second part they don't tell you. I take 1-2 grams before bed to help with depression and anxiety. It's amazing and I highly suggest it as long as you have a safe mental history. Acid is a crapshoot unless you know a chemist, and if you haven't seen the lab firsthand they aren't the chemist. I watched my father steadily lose his mind after the passing of my mom. He seemed to go through every stage of grief apart from acceptance. 5 years of what appeared to be a heartbroken man was actually a schizophrenic one. The diagnosis, often triggered by a traumatic event, resulted in his denial. He claims he's well. I can confidently say, he is no longer the person I remember to be my dad. His voice is different, raspy from the constant shouting at auditorial hallucinations. He no longer smiles. Laughs. He is always paranoid and furious. Although my story is about him, I've been more so affected by the people around him. Once his diagnosis was brought to light, various family members began to pity him, walk on eggshells around him, and the most bothersome, talk to him similar to that of a baby. He marches around demanding we acknowledge the fact that he is not retarded. I hope those reading this learn to treat others, especially those victims of losing a loved one, understand to treat them with dignity. My dad is not a broken person. He is a changed person, one still healing. As a crisis social worker, I've seen a lot, but the one that sticks with me is watching my aunt die of ALS. When she was diagnosed, she was an energetic extrovert who loved to joke and entertain. Watching her lose her ability to communicate was painful because you just knew it was killing her. 2. She was 100% aware of what was happening to her. She stopped speaking because she couldn't. And then she lost the ability to write. And then she couldn't even follow a conversation around her. She just drawled. It was heartbreaking. And there was no coming back and nothing anyone could do. My mom had ALS. It's awful. Her mind was sharp the entire time. When she could no longer speak, we had this monitor that would track her eye movements and allow her to type. She got pneumonia, and we were told she couldn't live without oxygen. Because of the mask, she could no longer use her eyes to communicate. So taking the oxygen mask off was planned. Went to the hospital and then saw one tear running down her face right when I saw her. She knew as soon as the mask came off she was going to die. I really can't imagine how terrible that feels. A coworker had her second child, started banging rails of coke daily, awake for 4 days, sleep for 2, rinse and repeat. It took a turn for the worse when we found her getting ducked for coke money in our office after hours. She's sober now, kids are okay. But this literally was a month-long endeavor, 20k up her nose. Postpartum poop makes me so nervous to have kids. I remember someone posted on Reddit a while ago that his wife refused to use their baby's name and believed it was an alien replacement or something. And everyone was like, take her to the hospital right now. And it turns out she had postpartum psychosis because it's a thing. JFC. This got way bigger than I thought, and I appreciate all your posts. I've been reading through them all. Thank you for opening up and sharing your experiences. Red Heart. Thank you for making this post. This is my story. When I was 11, my parents divorced. I was a wreck, had no friends and was constantly sad. Over the years I got worse and worse until at around age 13 I started getting suicidal. By 15 I was having suicidal thoughts on a daily basis. It was bad. I still didn't realize I was depressed somehow. Then at 16 I hurt myself for the first time. That's when I realized something was undeniably wrong. By that time I had friends who I could lean on and a great school. But years of verbal abuse from my mom has taken its toll. So at 16 I started getting therapy. That summer I went to camp and that was the catalyst for my healing. Over the next year I got better and better until I was no longer depressed. Get it? Kid, you're smart to recognize. Brilliant for getting help. Trust yourself. You're gonna be wonderful. My husband going through a serious depression starting last year. He was very angry at me and I had no idea why. He would jump on me for doing things like dropping a fork. He is in therapy now and not nearly as dark or angry. But at this time last year, I spent a lot of time in another room of our home. If there's one thing I wish depression didn't do, I wished it wouldn't cause serious irritation and anger. I'd get so pissed at the tiniest things I'd punch bruises into my ducking legs. I'm sorry you've had to deal with that. Wait, anger is a symptom of depression? Duck. This might be funny, but it is also serious. Watching the mental unraveling of Donald Trump over the last couple years has been unreal. It's incredibly serious. Watch him speak now and watch him speak 4 years ago. Severe decline and he still holds the football. I have heard the words Trump and dementor being linked together for a long time. Not sure how much there is to it, but sometimes I wonder. Made a friend who was a super cool guy and everyone always wanted to spend time with him and he was always included. There were so many little things here and there that tipped us off though that progressed from apologizing a lot for everything to being all robotic and lacking any sort of personality, to stalking, to violent mental breakdowns, to death threats and eventually a suicide attempt. Sounds like maybe BPD. Apologizes cause he's afraid you all would hate him. Gets robotic cause he doesn't want to say anything and his emotions are in a swing. Stalking cause he's afraid of losing his friends. Mental breakdown when he thinks people have abandoned him, then making death threats cause now he can't handle the perceived abandonment, then is guilt ridden, cry for help, or just so depressed about it all, suicide attempt. A friend of mine ended up in an abusive friendship and never recovered. Said friendship lasted over 6 years. No one could convince him that the other person was terrible to him. He ended up ghosting a lot of people he knew, including me. Last I saw of him, his self-esteem had basically tanked into the negatives. He was second-guessing almost every decision he had to make and was much more reserved. I heard through a mutual friend that he ended up moving away and going to therapy in the end. So I hope he got the help he needed. My grandfather was a wonderful painter. He did it professionally for decades. Even won some national awards for graphic design. He was diagnosed with dementia. Someone had commissioned a painting. He was still just as proud, but it was just awful. The face was twisted and distorted like a kid's drawing. Colors made no sense. Shadows were painted with pink. It was heartbreaking. My sister's mental state deteriorated rather rapidly, in my opinion. She would put her laundry in the washer and 2 hours later be complaining that someone stole all her clothing and she couldn't find them. She'd go shopping and leave her purchases in a shopping cart just outside the door while she got her car. Then she'd drive home and later wonder where all her purchases were. These are just a couple of examples that I'm comfortable relating here. Her husband finally took her to a clinic to be evaluated. She was referred to a psychiatrist who recommended hospitalization for her. She spent the rest of her brief life after that in a state mental hospital. I visited her there but was so dismayed by the conditions there with patients in various states of confusion that I kept my visits very brief. I thought she had finally gotten some peace when she died. At the very least she wasn't constantly in a state of confusion and worry. My dad got cancer a few years back. He hated himself for being sick and for putting our family through it. We didn't mind, but we saw what as a vulnerable, scared man he was, and he told us that didn't want to die and he would cry about dying because of my mum. He would beg me, as a 15-year-old, to look after my mum and sister like he never could. It was ducking hard. It was sad to see my strong dad end up like the rest of us, scared and weak. He came through it, fought and survived. He lived his last 4 years happy and cancer free. He dropped dead in front of me after a heart attack a couple weeks ago when I was 23. I'm grateful he died not knowing he was going to die, and lived the life he wanted to, because by hell it would have killed me more than it did him to watch him waste away from cancer. Moved into a basement unit below a nice dude. We talk and hang out occasionally. He started getting a bit weird with conspiracy theories, but we were like, whatever floats your boat. Started hearing conspiracy theory radio through the air vents at night. He started pushing stranger and stranger theories throughout the year. When we moved out he was doing straight up exorcisms in the room above our kitchen. We could hear big on evil demon being shouted and burning sage through the vents. Apparently a neighbor called the cops and they just asked him to shut the window, lol. Did he get the demon out though? I had this friend in year 8 who had just came out as transgender. She wanted to be male. First to me as her trusted friend a few months before, and I didn't know what it was. She explained and told her that she was still my friend no matter her gender. This for her was a real confidence boost. So when September came around, she was now Levi. But, being as teenagers are, they were all horrible to him, and me being the only accepting one, I stood by him to see him get sadder, angrier, and by November, suicidal. To the point when over the Christmas break he was admitted to a mental hospital and he never came back to our school, just because of the freaking students not accepting her. Just a heads up, if he said he wants to be a male, then you use he him pronouns the entire time. I had a neighbor who was a trans woman on her mental meds but back to bill off the meds. They were a sweet person. When they would go off the meds they would become a totally different person though, and the schizophrenia would really eat at them. Miss you, Billy. I was walking from class to class in the halls one day at school and my friend S ran up to me crying. She dragged me into the bathroom and locked us in the biggest stall and proceeded to have a complete breakdown in front of me, almost screaming that she didn't know what was wrong with her and she needed to go to a hospital and she felt like she was dying. I switched between just holding her and telling her it was all gonna be okay and giving her as much space as I could while she panicked and threw her arms around. I had her dial her mom's number on her phone and give it to me. I explained to her mom she needed to go to a psychiatric hospital and she got picked up. She was in school the next day and back to normal. She thanked me for helping her, and she's still one of my best friends to this day, although the breakdowns didn't stop. One of my close friends was a wild kid. She didn't do drugs but she drank like a truck driver. We went partying every day. Fun girl to be around. Amazing girl and very insightful. She was behind her cordial and when she came out to her mother reacted rather badly. I saw her get sadder every day. She began dating this guy she didn't really feel attracted to. She was in love with a girl. I didn't see her much but whenever I did, it was clear that wasn't the girl I knew. We got together because she told me she was incredibly sad. I thought we would go drinking but we just sat on a bench talking. She told me she thought she would go crazy. We didn't see each other or talk for some time. Some months pass by and she writes me that she's sorry. She was in the hospital for an attempted suicide. I saw the pictures of it. They were gruesome. Some other time passes and she writes me that she wants to meet up. She waits for us on the beach with a box of beer. Open arms. The girl I met. His friend was good at a lot of things and he had schizophrenia, so he slowly convinced himself that he couldn't do anything. Myself. Not sure if that counts. The moment I realized that something was wrong, I recorded every instance where depression hit me hard. I started it 1 year ago and still write in it, but reading it is like watching someone go mad. The person I was then is far from the person I am now. I hope things get better. Bro, you actually watched the whole video. I'd give you a high five if I was a human. Make sure to click the like button and subscribe for more great content. See you next time.